David, I don't really teach Goethe very often, and I was so delighted to read your translations, and I've just had this whale of a time the last few days reading these. And I kind of thought, what was it really that took you to this vast, incommensurable project of translating this extraordinary work?
I had an offer from Penguin as Hilary Laurie, who was the editor there, then asked me would I do it. And, I thought I did actually ponder. I wondered, but I didn't take very long to decide. I wanted to do it, and I should do it, and it took 8 years.
So not quite as long as it took to write.
No,
but pretty much.
Well, it's in two, as you know, it's in 2 bits, and so I got one part of the way, and it's the kind of thing that. Obviously, I was doing other things the whole time, but translation is a sort of. It's not exactly a day job, but it is something that you can sit down and do more or less well, whereas you can't sit down and write poetry, in my experience. You can hope you might be able to, but with translation, there's a text on the page, and that's the critical thing. You are trying to get across a text which pre-exists your efforts at it. So you've always got something to go on. And as I say, it's not just that you have off days, but some of it is manifestly better what you're doing than others, and that's only got partly to do with the intrinsic difficulty of the text. I think it's just whether you're on form or not in some way. So it was always there, and I've got scores of notebooks, and I translated it as it were, sitting down at a desk. I translated it in waiting rooms of various railway stations, and on aeroplanes, and on boats, and in olive groves, and all over the place. There was just something that I was... Because it's relatively easy, the text. You could take one text with you. And,
yes.
And it was a nice thing to be doing.
When you say that, I mean, when I was reading it, one of the things that I thought must be particularly challenging as a translator, and of course it's one of the challenges that critics face writing about it as well, is the question of genre. It has the subtitle, a tragedy, but actually, just as you were saying, the way you translated it in all these different places, it is a text that's made up of all these different bits, composed over a lifetime, fitted together in various ways, different genres, so dramatic pieces, episodic pieces, lyrical pieces, little bits of verse, and that's only in part one, and as soon as you get to part two, it becomes even more sort of exploded. So it's a critical problem to think of it as a whole, but I'm wondering, as a translation exercise, how did you face those very particular challenges?
Well, the order I did it in is not really the order in which he wrote it, so you can't match your translation to the phases of his writing. I mean, sometimes they run together, so I had a finished text, and I simply did work my way through it from line 1 to line 12,000 on whatever it is, and I didn't sort of do bits here and do bits there. But I was persuaded in this university, actually, by lectures from David Luke all that time ago, that, as you know, there are two ways of viewing this whole thing. One is, which seems to me a nonsense, that he miraculously, finishing, had homogenised the whole thing, so that we're talking about an intact text which is there to be understood in how all the bits fit together as a coherent whole, as something understood as a unity. Whereas Luke's view, and I think probably now the more common view, certainly mine, is that is the genetic one. That is the order of genesis, if you like.
Yes.
That you have to know when these things were. Or it helps enormously to know when they were written. And he didn't write them in the order. He did things as he felt up to doing them, or was inspired to them. There are phases of work. I said in the introduction, but I can never remember the actual. But it's not like James Joyce's Ulysses, and it's not like Alors Chef du Temps Perdu, which is a coherent work that took him 7 years or 12 years or 14 years. But that was what he was doing. He was doing other things, but in both cases, the author was pursuing something that was understood as a novel, whereas Goethe wasn't like that. And since Goethe himself said of himself, it sounds a bit immodest, but he said geniuses, genial natures, undergo continual puberties, or repeated puberties. That is to say that there are periods of his life when he is manifestly the same person. Everybody says that about Goethe. Goethe is Goethe, but there are the most extraordinary shifts in. It's not, I mean, in apprehension of the world, which is to say, in things that interest him, and that he sloughs off then, as it were, like a skin, moving on to the next. And Sturmendrang is one. The whole classical period is quite another. It's not to say that suddenly he dumps that and wants nothing to do with it. Absolutely not. And then there's the whole Westliche Divan again, which is a different sort of body of inspiration, really. And that's without considering that, the periods of extraordinary keenest interest in the outside world, what he's doing with it. I mean, from the adoration of nature as a sort of goddess incarnate, to becoming not just a good, but I mean, in the upper classes of geology or of medicine, of cloud formations, of things like that. So Goethe the scientist is not some other body. So now you follow that in translation only in that these are phases of life, and it's nice to know about them, and you see these discrepancies. And if you were worried about trying to translate in such a way that it's all fitted, the only way in which it fits, I say this not, I hope, boastfully, is it fits because I'm one person and I did it from start to finish. You probably know that À la recherche du temps perdu in the Penguin version was farmed out to particular translators for particular books, which is a convenience. It's a publishing house's convenience, because I suppose what you do want is a coherent endeavour coming from one person who, for good or ill, is that person.
No, I think that's right. But it's so interesting to see that as the sort of, on the one hand, you've got this all these differences and over a vast time, and all these different voices in a way that Goethe himself then went back and revised and changed, and then there's you, and taking it all in through your voice. But I mean, I suppose I have two questions about that. One is, how did you deal with those very different styles that are in there, from the kind of Sturm und Drang exuberance of the Walpurgisnacht, for example, to then the classical trimeters of the later Goethe, where he comes and revises it. Did you have to develop different voices or different strategies?
They're not different voices. They're different things I had to study and understand to the best of my ability, and then practice. And that is essentially this extraordinary apt question at the very outset, the very first translator of Goethe in 1825, this man Levison Gower, who, if I may just quote what he said about it, he translated into prose. For a start, he didn't even do that very accurately, and for a start, he left out bits that he perhaps thought indecent or blasphemous or whatever. So it's exceedingly patchy anyway. But the whole premise of it, his justification to give him the best possible word, is that he wrote of Faust, it teems with thought and has long exercised a widely spread influence by qualities wholly independent of metre and rhyme. And as a premise, that's catastrophic. It's just not true. And it's perhaps difficult to grasp that the whole thing only exists by virtue of its form, and its form is first. If you start trying to extract out of it, as you might do if you wanted a kind of Goethe Handbuch durch das Jahr, as people are endlessly doing, then of course you can take out bits and pieces, but you could, in the way that you can quote Shakespeare like that. But the actual medium of it is that which it is. So in my view, you had absolutely no option but to do your best, understanding you would fail, but do your best to translate this into verse. And that then did, to come back to your question, means shifting very radically from well, even this exceedingly engaging Knittel Faust madrigal verse of the first part. And here, in a way, this is one of the few advantages of being English, that it is the iambic pentameter and the kind of Knittel Faust sort of unstressed syllables making up 4 or 5. That is so pleasing to the English ear. By English, I mean the writer in English. That's relatively easy to do, because it is so much at home in the English poetic language, precisely because it is a natural rhythm of English speech. Now, both English and German are languages that scan by stress. So you've got a prosody, which is kindred. There are differences because German stresses are much heavier.
Yes.
You can always tell where the stress is for. Whereas if you take an English word like irrepressible or thing like that, then you know where it's going to fall. But there are an awful lot of sort of swallowed syllables. Whereas in German, it's clear. So you're operating within a kindred, well, the same prosody with kindred disciplines within it. Now, when that shifts to the pure lyric, as you've already said, an awful lot of this is deeply lyrical. It really is a mélange des genres in a way that the French could never possibly have tolerated. But again, the English tradition has that. I mean, there are, not just that there are loads of songs in Shakespeare, but there are passages where the action halts, and there are lyrical interludes, and lyric almost in the sense of singing. And in this definitely there are kind of operatic interludes, large or chorales or.
Did you read? I mean, I was very struck by how Shakespearean it was. Just reading it again. Did you read Shakespeare to kind of help you find a voice? I know as a translator, quite often, if I'm struggling with a poet or a prose writer, actually, I sometimes try and tune in to something similar in English just to get some of the tricks. Or to get the voice in some way, or to get a hint of what it would be in English if it's very foreign to me. And I'm just wondering, were there any authors like that helped you, or was it possible just to go sort of?
Well, I read Shakespeare all the time. I mean, so it's that I'm nearly always reading a Shakespeare play or the sonnets, and so it is in me as I don't always remember where the bits come from, but I mean there are all sorts of lines. And tones of voice. Yes. Things like, so have I heard and do in part believe it. Extraordinary lines like that, which are so close to common speech, and yet somehow there's something in anyway. So I was reading anyway. And also because of doing Hölderlin, I didn't make a very good fist of it, but I taught myself enough of classical Greek to be able to understand what he was doing when he was translating it. And I worked my way through by writing a prose. I wrote it out, I wrote the Greek out in my handwriting, and I wrote underneath it a sort of in pencil, a literal, as far as I could work it out. And then I tried to get my way into these texts, a lot of text actually. So when it came to doing the classical trinities and things like that, I had quite a lot of understanding of that. Got quite a lot of understanding that through Hölderlin, and again there's something of interest here because the classical languages scan by length and shortness of syllable, and the German way of doing it was simply to make a long syllable a stressed one and a short syllable an unstressed, and that's a completely handy way of doing it. There are purists who say you shouldn't be doing it like that, but that's how the German tradition did it, and therefore that's how Goethe did it. And I didn't quite do it like that with Hölderlin, but when it came to doing classical trimeters, which is 6 beats, they are 6 beat lines, and there's an extraordinary bit at the beginning of Act 3 in Part 2 when Helen introduces herself, And it's absolutely wonderful, these long lines with the 6 beats coming. Now, as soon as you've done that, this is a good instance of why it's wholly wrong to suppose you can do it without the verse. Because in the course of that scene, she and Faust approach, there is a rapprochement. And the first rapprochement, on her part, she listens to how he's speaking, and he's speaking blank verse. It's iambic pentameters, and she drops a syllable, she drops a cop, and she speaks to him first in iambic pentameters, and that's the beginning of their intimacy. But she's already picked up what Lynceus, the watcher, how he's been rhyming, and she says, well, I want to do that.
Yeah. No,
and then there's
beautiful.
this extraordinarily sexy kind of coming together through rhyme. And that's a good instance of where you can't possibly put the rhyme anywhere else, because when they rhyme on these words, that is there, she's understanding it. And they're coming together precisely in that. So it passes from her trimeters, which are clearly classical, to iambic pentameter, which is approaching him. And then the other, fitting to the medieval context, is the lyrical rhyming verse of troubadour and so forth. You couldn't possibly do it without having a shot at that. It's all in there. You can actually see it working. There's that lovely poem that you know in Westöstliche Diva mit Beramgur sagt man hat den Reim erfunden, which again is a lovely love poem based on the two hitting the same rhyming. You know, actually, he speaks and she rhymes, or she speaks and he rhymes. And completely lovely.
You've just reminded me of a bit, right at the end where Gretchen is there and Faust is trying to call her away, where so Faust commit. I should be quoting from the English, but I just want to make a point about the German. And then Gretchen says, "Oh, Weile." And Faust replies, "Eile," hurry. So stay and hurry. And so Goethe uses the rhyme.
Yes, right.
And there are lots of instances like
There
that.
are
And I know
loads
it's something you've worked on keeping.
As you know, this technique of compensation is not even a technique. You're forced into it in translating, which basically means if you can't do it here, do it there. But if they ever rhymed across in part one, or ever, if it was a dialogue where somebody says this and somebody matches that, which is actually an answer to it, and he answers it with a rhyme, so the rhyme is going across it, then you have to do it. You have to do it there.
Yeah. It leads me on to a question which, again, I've been thinking, I've got some questions about characters and translation, and I suppose one of the obvious ones is Faust and Mephistopheles. Did you think of them in different voices at all?
Yeah, I did. I much prefer Mephistopheles. He is at least honest. I mean, Faust is just so full of dishonesty and bad faith.
Well, you call him, I think, criminally irresponsible.
Well,
and,
so he is throughout. I mean, he's the least likeable character in the whole series.
That's right. And I was just really struck by that again. What an extraordinary protagonist he is, and so unlikable and so unsympathetic.
It's a catastrophe. And the thing about, when you said that the business about tragedy, I understand it as the tragedy of a man living badly. I mean, it's an existentialist tragedy. Yeah. This is how not to live your life, endlessly grasping after the next thing. It's a philosophy of life which is purely instrumental. All people that you meet are instrumental, in his case, as it were, in proving that he will never be contented. So when he is in love with Gretchen and she is in love with, he has to prove, that is to say, he has to live in a fashion which is absolutely anti-life in order to make his point with the devil. This is a wager, not a pact. So he's trying to win something.
Yes, I found that very persuasive as an interpretation.
It's absolutely monstrous. I mean, it's as though you devise a way of being in the world which is, I don't just mean wholly unlovable, which is terribly destructive of everybody around you and of himself as a person as well. I mean, if you're finding your own essence in an extent, that is a catastrophic way of defining it. So
I think there's in the A.S. Wyatt's bit of the introduction, she quotes Moretti saying that Goethe chose Faust as his protagonist, and then actually noticed that Mephistopheles was by far the more interesting character. So, you did think of different voices for different characters, and use a different range of approaches then?
Well, it's not up to me to, as it were, make him more likeable or make him less likeable. So I don't think I translated consciously anyway, using a language which would point up the fact that this was the man in hell. It's just that, I mean, that is what Goethe does. The two, so you do pass from something which is, I mean, myths still sometimes deliberately undercut him when it's up and up and up and up and up, and then suddenly it's undercut. It's not actually it's the only prose scene left when he just says, "Sie ist die Erste nicht." She's not the first. That's the truth. This is the oldest nasty game in the book, basically. You seduce somebody and you leave her. And she's left picking up the pieces in the sense of, dead baby and all the rest of it. Sie ist die Erste nicht, she's not the first.
The other thing that struck me reading it was, and you mentioned some of this, that Schiller called it a philosophical poem. You talked about it as a poem, but actually it's a drama.
Yeah.
And did you think about the dramatic aspects when you were translating, or have you ever worked with a theatre company that do it?
I've seen productions, and I've seen the Faust films a couple of times. Clinton's one, and it is in that sense immensely dramatic. Or Faust is the most dramatic of the three. I think Faust Part 1, yes, also. But I think these very long slowings up of it quite deliberately, in an operatic fashion. You don't expect opera to be moving, because you can warble one sentence in opera for 10 minutes, which is roughly what's going on here sometimes. Or it's like, I think I said, it's like a Bach chorale, where it's useless hoping you just hurry up a bit and get through the text, which is actually that long. That's not really the point. I mean, and it's very like that here. There are these sort of, it's not stasis, but they're interludes. And I can't think of that as being very... I was conscious translating that some of this is not really going to appeal to very many people, except people who are, as it were, studying it. Because
I thought you made the point very well that it's that there's an irony about the scene where Faust rewrites the beginning of the Gospel. In the beginning was the word, in the beginning was the deed, and then he's the most undramatic dramatic hero. He does very little. He's absent or asleep or dead for large parts of the play, and it is a kind of thought play in the sense that there are, contemporary drama deals a lot in this actually, doesn't it? It's sort of thinking, putting thoughts and debates into characters. So I can see exactly what you mean, that it's that there's an argument that actually it's on the page really, and it's about what's on the page rather than maybe on the stage.
There have been full performances.
Fantastic performances as well. Yeah, no, exactly. You lead me on to a question actually, which I sort of had in the back of my mind, and I think I know what you might be going to say now. Did you change your opinion of the play translating it in any way? Did you come away with a different view, having spent this time on it?
Well, I think exactly as you do about this. Translation is close reading, and it's only the close reading which is necessary and deeply enjoyable when you translate. That is sometimes someone's shame the first time you've really read it, even text that you reckon to know terribly well. Yeah. So translating it never rapidly, and the whole lot of it led me into a love of it, really. And I would never have said yes to it if I thought this is going to be abhorrent. There are lots of it is abhorrent, but that's intentional. That's within the play. My gain in it was colossal. I could feel that I am benefiting from this, and therefore that's what comes if you address yourself to a text which is, so to speak, worth your while. And this is so manifestly worth your while in its richness. It's the abundance of it, and also because it suits my worldview, I think, just this coexistence of incommensurables. So it's not that, secretly all along hankering that this should make linear sense.
I interviewed Don Patterson once talking about his translations of Rilke, and he was really interesting in saying that translating Rilke allowed him to say things which he couldn't say in his own voice. And so that was very interesting in itself. But then also afterwards, he said when he'd finished translating Rilke, he likened it to a stream and said that there were kind of channels of language that had been laid down in the translating of Rilke, which then stayed after he'd finished the Rilke. And so it allowed him to write in a different way. And particularly, I think he was thinking of the sonnets that he wrote immediately after he translated Rilke. And I'm wondering if there's that sense for you as well, that doing this sort of vast translation gave you a chance to speak in different ways, which and whether that's remained with you, or whether it gave you opportunities in English which you hadn't had.
That's the question, really, and I think we've talked about this before. Effectively, if you write yourself, then when you translate, at the back of your mind is always, what's in this for me? And you try not to let it interfere, because, and here we're back on this seems to me the fundamental conflict, but it's a good conflict in the business of translating, because in order for a thing to be brought across from a foreign language into your own tongue, this is what I meant earlier, you have to deploy your total linguistic resources today. That is, as far as you've got and the understanding of your, there's got to be, I don't mean this fancifully, actually there at your disposal while you're doing it. And why? Because everybody knows this. The average life of even a good translation is one generation. That's why Penguin Classics just keep redoing and Penguin. And yet the originals live on and on and on and on and on. And that is of great interest. It's perfectly obvious, but it's of great interest. And the reason is that in the originals is the original autonomy of creation, that whoever was doing it had at his or her disposal all the resources of his or her language at that point and was deploying them for a purpose of their own. Now, when you come to translate it, the only way that these things will be enabled to live even a little while is if you somehow get somewhere near the liveliness, the Lebendigkeit of the original. And you can only do that, as I say, if you are trying effectively to write a poem. Yeah. And the difficulty clearly is that in the act of writing something of your own, a poem or whatever, you have absolute autonomy. It's an area left where you're at nobody's bidding, and in fact that's the essence of it. Only you can. It relies entirely on your honesty. Only you can say whether this is your understanding of the truth or not. That's what autonomy means. When you come to translate, there's a text on the page, and if it's a text that you love, and I nearly always translate a text that I love, then it's an act of service. You want to see this thing in circulation, because you know it's onto you, and you wish that should be, that possibility should be given to others. So that's an act of service. And there's a text there. You are not making it up. This is not the blank sheet that you sit down in front of if you're trying to do something. You know, it's the text, and it's that sort of fighting between autonomy, without which it won't work, and service, which is what it is required of you to give, that's of interest, and why, in a sense. So when Don talks of, I understand that exactly, because in a way that's what's in it for you, is the widening and extending and varying of your own linguistic possibilities, which you get, and you know exactly with Hölderlin the idea that which is completely conscious that he would get better at German by going through this extraordinarily difficult Greek. This is what's meant by going abroad and coming back then in better possession of your. When he says das eigene muss so gelernt sein wie das Fremde, your own has to be learned as well as that which is foreign. And that happens every time you translate. I mean, you know that from doing Volker Braunberg particularly, and the others that you've been very close to in that fashion. Something is ingested which is of good for you. Yes,
no, definitely. And I guess that's also sort of monolinguists studying German, you know, they end up speaking better English for it, and having a kind of wider range as wider sensitivity.
It alerts you to the differences of languages, even cognate languages like it alerts you to what your language can do and the foreign one can't, or vice versa most often. And then you can push that, you can say, well, English can't normally do this, but I could perhaps shove it until it looks as though it was intended to do.